Hello again, Ancestry cousins and Inquiring minds. I wanted to work on a video about free colored people living in DC and the surrounding area during the Civil War and how it affected them. I do not see, have not seen any movies, videos, things like that in anything on television, in books or anything. If a story like that exists, I don't know of it. So I started doing what I do, searching through newspapers and stuff like that. So the story begins with my great grandfather Lloyd Randolph Johnson in his confrontation with a soldier from the Second DC Volunteers. So that's a part of the story right there, with learning about how these people became a part of the. He was a volunteer. He was an early volunteer. He volunteered in 1858. He was a volunteer, and then when it became where they needed more military, a stronger force, they enacted a draft. And most people don't know that there was a Civil War draft. So I asked my mother, she didn't know. I asked my friend who's a teacher in DC, she did not know. So, and then I asked my mother's friend, she did not know. Okay. So I asked my mother, did she know that free colored people were included in that draft? She did not know. My friend did not know. My mother's friend did not know. I asked my mother, did she know that free colored people may have lost their property during the Civil War? She did not know. My friend did not know. But my mother's friend did know because she is very proactive in the Brightwood community. Information is going on because that's the community that they generally live in. So they live near down the street from Fort Stevens. And this is a part of why this story became so interesting to me, because I never even paid attention to that this place was actually a fort in Washington D.C., right behind the McDonald's that I used to go to when I went to lunch at Paul Junior High School. Okay, so anyway, they did take land from they took the land from a free black woman, or colored, indigenous, whatever you want to classify as, and her name was Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. She was born in Charles County in about 1821, and she lived in Brightwood until she died in 1917. So I started researching her because I was like, whoa, I didn't know anything about this. And so when I started researching stuff about Fort Stevens, this is when I came upon this information. Now, this information will go to different parts because I'm going to talk about the soldier interaction, but I just want to talk about her, and what happens with her family in following her line with this confiscation of the land for a fort for the Civil War. Okay, so she was born in PG County in the early 1800s. This is from NPS, which is the National Park Service. This is from their website. As a child, Thomas and her parents moved to Vinegar Hill, a small community of free blacks located in northwest Washington, D.C., approximately 2 miles south of the Maryland border. The family settled on a high point beside the 7th Street Pike, a major road leading to downtown Washington. And they have a picture of her, it's a nice picture. When the Civil War began, the nation's capital was protected by a single fort, Fort Washington, located 12 miles south of the city along the Potomac River. Realizing the defense of this capital was dangerously inadequate. Following the Union defeat at Manassas in July 1861, Congress voted in favor of constructing a ring of forts and other defense works to encircle the city. Soon afterwards, miles of trees were cleared and building commenced. By the end of this war, 68 forts, 93 batteries, 20 miles of rifle pits, and 32 miles of military roads surrounded the capital, and Washington became the most heavily fortified city in the world. They have a picture of the fort, and just you just see just like flat land, some trees, because it was farmland. That's what it was. It was farmland. The Thomas and 7th Street Turnpike property, then owned by Elizabeth and her siblings, was an ideal and necessary location for the fort. In September 1861, Union troops took possession of her land and ultimately destroyed her home, barn, orchard, and garden to build Fort Manassas, later renamed Fort Stevens. According to Thomas, at the time her house was being demolished, she was holding her 6-month-old baby and weeping beneath a sycamore tree. As soldiers removed her belongings, a tall, slender man dressed in black approached her and said, "It is hard, but you shall reap a great reward." The man offering comfort was believed to be President Lincoln. Thomas's encounter with the stranger was a story she told throughout her life, helping her story to gain recognition as part of the history of Fort Stevens. In July 1864, Confederate troops under the leadership of General Jubal Early attempted to invade Washington. Fort Stevens and nearby Fort Debussy led the defense of the capital as skirmishes broke out. President Lincoln, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, and members of the president's cabinet traveled to Fort Stevens to observe the 2-day battle. So they're watching. The president watched the fighting as Confederate sharpshooters fired upon the fort. President Lincoln became the second sitting president to come under enemy fire as Union forces successfully swatted the invasion. Following the Civil War, Elizabeth Thomas continued to reside near Fort Stevens. She remained the owner of portions of the fort, and during the course of her life, she amassed a considerable amount of land in the vicinity. At the turn of the century, Thomas sold some of her Fort Stevens acreage to an influential Washingtonian who hoped to preserve the remaining earthworks and establish a park. In 1911, she joined veterans of the Battle of Fort Stevens for the dedication of a monument to President Lincoln, located on the site where he observed the 1864 conflict. For many years, Elizabeth Thomas fought for compensation for the damages and loss for her property incurred during the war. She was eventually awarded $1,835 in 1916, a year before she died. During the 1920s, the federal government acquired Fort Stevens, and the site became a unit of the National Park Service in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, the Civil Conservation Corps reconstructed a portion of the fort. Today, Fort Stevens is a neighborhood gathering place where the stories of the battle and Elizabeth Thomas continues to be told. I'm going to read from, this book is called I Knew Lincoln. And it's Aunt Elizabeth Thomas, heroine of Fort Stevens. Washington lies in a low area on the Potomac River, but is surrounded by the northern side in high elevation from one side to the other of the District of Columbia. In Civil War days, there were forts that would control the incoming roads. Later, these old abandoned barracks were changed into schools for colored children. General Early, after getting into Maryland, attempted to capture Washington by coming from the north. He had to pass this Fort Stevens to succeed. As Grant's troops were in Virginia, much excitement was caused in Washington when it was found out that Early was about to attack from the north in an area protected by this fort. I read the newspapers and stuff, and it's interesting because it just would say people would be passing in the street with their furniture, like after their house was destroyed out in the country, they would be walking along 7th Street Pike with furniture, and it's just like, it's mind blowing. As Grant's troops were in Virginia, much excitement was okay. Every effort was made to strengthen the place. Loyal citizens, as well as available military men, endeavored to help while awaiting assistance from across the Potomac. Even Lincoln and cabinet were excited and rushed to the spot. Not far from the Fort Stevens area was a locality known as Vinegar Hill, where many colored people of German and Indian mixtures had built their homes. Colored people of German and Indian mixtures had built their homes. It was sad that they witnessed the destruction of their homes and barns to make room for breastworks. Below this vicinity, on 16th Street, what is now Georgia Avenue in Brightwood, was a large tract of 88 acres belonging to a colored woman, Elizabeth Thomas. It was a most beautiful spot and particularly controlled the entrance to the city and was the most important location of all. A large portion of this was taken to build Fort Stevens. It was needed and needed badly. The cattle, pigs, chickens were needed to feed the soldiers, and the buildings were in the way and must go. While patriotic to the cause, this old colored woman did not want to give up everything, especially when there was no hope of ever getting the property restored. You know, I improvised that a little bit. She resisted the Army's action and finally was forcibly removed from her home by having it torn down over her head, and they piled her furniture around her under an old sycamore tree. I didn't embellish that. She had a 6-month-old baby named Maria in her arms. Fight as she might for her home, she found that she could do nothing, and exhausted with her child in her arms, she sat down to rest under the sycamore tree, which is still standing. Here she saw all of her life savings destroyed. The officers who had handled the situation with as much diplomacy as possible finally called for the assistance of President Lincoln, who had visited the spot several times before and on occasion had been quite friendly with the old colored woman. Arriving just as the home was being torn to pieces to make a magazine, seeing the livestock being driven away, Lincoln hastily moved toward the spot where the unfortunate woman with her babe in her arms was crying as if her heart was breaking. She had cried until she was exhausted and felt that all was lost forever. Bending affectionately over her, Lincoln listened to her pleas for her home. Then he said, "It is hard, but you shall reap a great reward." When Lincoln told her that when the battle was over, he would see that she was paid and that all her stock that was taken away, that her home would be restored, she readily consented to go with him to her barn, which the soldiers had turned into a house, and put her furniture in it. She loved Lincoln and believed so much in his word that when the Rebs came, she cooked up the Union troops and in times helped with the ammunition, which was stored in the stone basement of her old home. During the battle, she even had her old shotgun by her side to kill any Rebs who tried to hurt Lincoln, who knew in them days the gun was a handy instrument in the hands of every colored man and woman. Now she forgot self and home and was fighting for Lincoln. And she was contributed all to prevent the capture of Washington. During my boyhood days, we often went to Mrs. Thomas in Brightwood to have school picnics, and some teachers boarded all of the summer with her. She certainly liked to tell her story about Lincoln. Regularly as clockwork each year, the members of the Grand Army of the Republic who had taken part of the battle held their reunions on Mrs. Thomas' porch and about the house, which had been restored, and here they all told stories of the fight. One old barracks had been changed into the military school roll for colored children. Military school roll for children. I knew nearly every teacher, and with these, Mrs. Thomas, the patriot of Brightwood, was always most friendly. They kept her supplied with the latest news and newspapers and gossip. Mrs. Thomas often told the following story at guard reunions, and the soldiers who were at her side during the battle confirmed it. While the battle was raging and bullets were whizzing everywhere, Miss Thomas was busy as a bee doing her duties in helping the defenders of the fort. Suddenly, she looked out of the basement window and saw Lincoln standing up on the bank of the newly constructed trenches. Forgetting everything. Ooh, don't do that. She excitedly yelled to those near him, "My God, make that fool get down off that hill and come in here." See how the story didn't change? You read it one, you'll read it'll be something else somewhere else. Just then, a bullet felled an officer near the president, and he left the dangerous spot. So he got shot. She said Lincoln just had to smile when she yelled at him. She was so afraid he might get hurt. The president kept his word and came back to see her often and laughed over the battle, but he was assassinated before he could see that she was paid the $6,000 damages. Historians of the Civil War who knew the story of Fort Stevens have not mentioned this heroine who gave all she could to Lincoln and country and relied on the promise of the emancipator of her race to reward her damages. But the newspapers of today in which she lived annually wrote of Aunt Betty and even took her picture at the regular Grand Army of the Republic reunions, which were held on the old battlefield. When the boulder was dedicated on the spot of her farm where Lincoln stood in the battle, Mrs. Thomas was the main guest of honor, and accompanying pictures by a newspaper photographer shows her in the stand with the speakers. Miss Eva Chase and Miss Rachel Bell, who were teachers who spent 12 summers regularly with her as boarders. They were great Republican women and guard workers and attempted to write a story of her life. I felt really lucky some time ago when the surviving one, Miss Bell, who had known me for years, stated that they had collected much valuable material on Miss Thomas and were going to write an article about her. But now that I was going to write on the people who loved Lincoln, and Aunt Betty certainly was one, she was going to give me everything on Miss Thomas that she had, and she kept her promise. And from the clippings, notes, and photographs, I have written the following account that from concurring with her grandson, Billy Grant. And I guess that's William Grant. Okay, Billy Grant probably is William Grant. So let's go back. We'll get to him. I think this is the guy. Wow, I didn't read this previously before making this video. So while the nation seemed to have forgotten Aunt Betty after Lincoln died, the National Federation of Colored Women Clubs, a nationwide organization, on September 22nd, 1924, heard this program at Fort Stevens with the leading men and women of her race in attendance. Miss Bell, who knew Miss Thomas better than anyone else, was president of the Elizabeth Thomas Citizens Association and gave me the program showing Mrs. Thomas as she looked 50 years after she was taking part in the battle. She was seated in the grandstand while the orators of the day praised her for her part of saving the city. From her old faded family photograph, I was able to restore the features of Miss Thomas as she looked about the time of the Civil War. A lifelong fight was made by Mrs. Chase and Miss Bell to get Miss Thomas the money Lincoln had promised her, but she died before she could get it fulfilled. And it's at Evening Star, Wednesday, October 17, 1917, carried the following article, which gives the story of Miss Thomas, almost like the story told to her friends and relatives, and which formed the basis of my story. Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas died at Brightwood. Her history was connected with Fort Stevens, where Lincoln was once under fire. Miss Elizabeth Thomas, whose life's history was closely connected with the history of Fort Stevens, where President Lincoln was under fire, when Early made his attempt to capture Washington, died Saturday at her home on the site of the old fort in Brightwood, D.C. Miss Thomas died from blood poisoning, resulting from a 3-year-old wound sustained from working in her garden. Funeral services were held this afternoon at 1 o'clock at the Trinity AME Church at 781 Morton Street Northwest. Interment was at Harmony Cemetery. Mrs. Thomas was the former owner of the site of Fort Stevens. Her great grandmother was Nora Butler, a famous belle of colonial days who created a sensation by eloping with Morning Glory Proctor, an Indian councilman. And I tried to look them up. I Googled them. I can't find nothing on Nora Butler, a famous belle. What they was trying to connect me to was Irish Belle, the lady Butler that married the slave, and that was connected with the Calverts. And so I don't know that that was her though, because I mean her name was Eleanor Butler. Nora Butler could have been a nickname for her, but it said a famous belle. I did not see her as being a belle, marrying an Indian councilman. It says she married an Indian slave. So I didn't think that they were the same people. The stories didn't line up, but I could find nothing in Google on either one of these two people. So, because I wanted to know, like, oh, what's the genealogy? You said Magic Morning Glory Proctor, an Indian councilman. Okay, if anybody could find that, that would be interesting. So anyway, Mrs. Thomas was 96 years old. She was born in Charles County, Maryland, moving in her early childhood to the home of the site of Fort Stevens. The family bought a farm, 88 acres. Oh shoot. I did it. I moved that mouse too fast. Okay, where am I at now? All right, so okay, the family bought during the Civil War when the division of the Confederate Army under General Early made his attempt to capture Washington. The home of Miss Thomas was taken by the defenders of the national capital. So basically, it just talks about is reading her obituary, which is online. So the next article is I'm not going to read like the whole obituary because I'm going to move on. I'm just going to go back to Chronicling America and read some newspaper articles that I found of her. Elizabeth Thomas honored. I had the date, that's why. This was August 7th, 1909. She was still alive. Elizabeth Thomas honored attended reception by a Citizens Association named after her. She was the president of this association. And so here's another one that was from September 28th, 1915. It says, "Will tell Civil War story." Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas to speak at Fort Stevens, so she liked to tell her Civil War story. Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas, president of the Elizabeth Thomas Citizens Association at Fort Stevens, would tell her story. Ms. Thomas gave up her home to save the nation's capital when President Lincoln, in person, ordered it to be removed to establish Fort Stevens. Okay, the next article is from September 23rd, 1932, U.S. purchases historic fort. 6 acres of the site of Fort Stevens, where President Lincoln stood under fire when the Confederate attack menaced the Capitol July 11th, 1864. See how they sensationalize that? They said they menaced the Capitol. Have purchased by the nation's capital, Park and Planning. It was announced yesterday that the ground was acquired at an unnamed price from heirs of Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas, colored, who inherited from slave days. Now, this is what this article says. See how they switched it up? The transaction ended a 7-year effort of the government to acquire the site. The Fort Stevens Park, situated on Piney Branch Road, west of George Avenue, will be used as a link in the Fort Drive, connecting Civil War forts which encircled the city The project was initiated in 1925. Okay, so we got this last. Was this the last article? Oh, okay. I got two articles left. I gotta hurry up. Because I try to make them under 30 minutes. The Bleak House, once country residence of Alexander R. Shepard along the early estates of Georgia Avenue. I just ordered this book about the estates, the confiscated lands. I haven't gotten it yet. So it said, if by John Claggett Proctor. If one were to ask the average Washingtonian the location of Vinegar Hill, he would probably receive the reply, I don't know. And yet, there is a well known settlement in the vicinity of Brightwood, accompanied by colored people, which has borne this name for so many years that no one seems to know just when it was first so called it. And the only reason assigned for calling it by this name lies in the tradition that it was dubbed with this appellation by the mail carrier who once delivered mail in this vicinity. Jeez, girl. And another question about this place. I thought you wasn't supposed to start a sentence with "and," which is hard to answer, is that too when it is first settled. Indeed, the writer visited this place recently and had an interesting talk with Henry Brown and Mrs. Ellen Marshall, early natives of this particular section, but though they are getting along in years, they had no knowledge of its origin, so they don't know where the name Vinegar Hill came from. One thing we do know is that it was settled long before the Civil War and played a part, so to speak, in that great conflict, since it was probably not more than 600 feet distant from the earthworks at Fort Stevens as we know it today, and at least one of the cabins, accompanied by the residents, had to be torn down where the battle was fought there in July 1864. This particular cabin belonged to a colored woman named Elizabeth Thomas, but generally spoken of as Aunt Betty. Okay, Lincoln knew Aunt Betty, and Aunt Betty knew Lincoln. And it was upon one of the president's visits to the fort that he was halted at the sight of her sitting with her baby in her arms under a sheltering branches of a sycamore tree that grew near the fort. The woman and child were weeping, according to the story, which is undoubtedly entirely true. Piled around them was a collection of household furnishings that had been taken from what a short time before had been her home. But it was now dismantled and in ruins, and for the requirements of the war needed the cellar of her house for a powder magazine. And the house, which probably stood off at a distance from the main settlement, had stood in exactly the right place for it. The president is said to have looked at the ruin and turned to the woman and said, "It is very hard, but your reward shall be great." It is doubtful if the reward was dollars and cents ever came. Aunt Betty always remembered Lincoln's promise and often said, if Lincoln had not been killed, he would have made the government settle for my home. This esteemed relic of Early's raid on Washington, who continued to reside in the vicinity of the fort until her death at an advanced age, was always glad to recount this sad episode in her early life when General McCook appeared among the cabins and said, "I want you, women and children, to get away from here. These cabins will be burned." "For what?" said Aunt Betty. "I am going to form a line of battle," answered McCook. Said Aunt Betty, looking at a crippled man of a garrison. "You can't form much of a line of battle with that force when there ain't none of them can fire a gun. You will have to move out. The rebels are coming." And again ordered the general. "It ain't nothing," cried Aunt Betty. "The rebels have always been here." However, in spite of Aunt Betty's protest, the cabins were destroyed as was other property in the vicinity as a military measure. But when in other years the Grand Army held any exercises at Fort Stevens, this old colored woman was always present at as the guest of honor. Nowadays, and for some days past, Vinegar Hill has been off the beaten path, and comparatively few people now ever travel that way, preferring to use the many other thoroughfares available in this neighborhood, particularly the Military Road. But during the early days, when there were not so many streets and roads around Washington, it was a welcome little village to the farmers who used this road, for the settlement was right on the Milk House Ford Road, which has for its present eastern entrance at point just opposite Peabody Street, where it intersects with 13th Street. However, it is no longer known as Milk House Ford Road, the name having been changed in recent years to Rock Creek Ford Road. But just why it was so changed is one of the other many things the writer cannot answer, except that the present name probably suited someone's fancy just little bit better than the old one. Yet, it does seem that the changing of the names of the old roads around Washington, which changes history, and you don't know what you're looking for, which have become historic, should certainly not be done without a most substantial and excellent reason. Yeah. For instance, here is a road that is in all likelihood one of the oldest, all the way back up, one of the oldest, in and around the district. Bershk in a map begun in 1856 shows it was running through the extreme northern part of the district from the Rockville Road eastward until it intersects with the Rock Creek Church Road. Later, that part of the road eastward from Georgia Avenue became known as Shepherd Road or Magnolia Avenue, and a long stretch of this part is now known as Concord Avenue. To the north of the Masonic Temple in Brightwood, just as west of Georgia Avenue, there is another short stretch, but the name of this part also has been changed to Rock Creek Ford Road. Certainly one name sounds as pleasing to the ear as the other, and accordingly, if for no reason, better reason than the older name should have been retained. Just a word about the older residents of Vinegar Hill. Ethnologically, they appear to combine the white, the Negro, and the Indian. At any rate, they are good citizens, and they are at the least in the worries of the captain of the 6th precinct in this territory this settlement is located, for there are seldom any arrests made here. So they're saying they white, they Indian, and they Negro. And the other one, it said he was German and Indians, okay? They are industrious and thrifty, and many own their own property. And as far back as anyone seems to know, they were free colored people. As the writer has said, this is a very old settlement. And just recently, in extending the Fort Drive through the northern part of the place, a cemetery was discovered at about 14th Street that has been almost forgotten. In the writer's records of cemeteries in and around Washington, he had made a note of this particular burial ground taken from the city directory in 1833, in which Hillary Green is mentioned as sexton and his address given as Piney Branch Road Extended. But the exact location of the cemetery was a mystery until the graves were recently encountered and 35 or more bodies removed up to date. One of the oldest living natives of Brightwood today is Mrs. Alfred G. Osborne, whom the writer has had the pleasure of knowing for many years, the most delightful woman with intellect far and above her age. She freely recalls incidents of people, particularly in the vicinity, back in her childhood days. Her maiden name is Beale, and she was the daughter of William Brooke Beale, two well known Maryland colonial family names. Prior to the Civil War, Mr. Bell owned two large tracts of land along Georgia Avenue and north of the Military Road. The daughter, Mrs. Osborne, has always lived in the immediate. This is us. They be having some long newspaper articles. A vicinity at which she was born, and her early schooling was had in the neighborhood. Many will recall Alfred G. Osborne, Mrs. Osborne's husband, was one of the earliest merchants in Brightwood, where he conducted a crossroads store, and post office at the northwest corner of Rock Creek Ford Road and George Avenue from 1878 to 1882 and 1886 to 1890. He was Justice of the Peace for this section of the district and was a past master of Stanbury Lodge number 24 FAAM. The Osborne family, of which A.G. Osborne was a descendant, living in this neighborhood at such an early date that no one seems to know just when they came here and whence they came. Many will recall A.G. Osborne's two brothers, George W. James and T. Farmers, whose farm was to the east of Piney Branch Road, included the property of the Washington Transit Company and 14th and Decatur Street. See, these was farms. They're talking about farms. You see? I can't even imagine like you go up there right there, you like to just wipe all that stuff out of your mind and it's just see nothing but like farms, orchards, and pigs and cows. And so, with this dyed in the wool background, is there any wonder why the writer should seek out Mrs. Osborne to find out something about this almost forgotten cemetery? And this surmise is correct. And according to her recollection, this God's acre was laid out probably long before the Civil War and was originally a part of the property once owned by Aunt Betty Butler, a free colored woman who made her living by selling lots in this burying ground to her humble neighbor. So this Aunt Betty Butler was selling parts of her land so people could be buried on it. The Henry Brown and Miss Ellen Marshall, before referred to, are grandchildren of Mrs. Butler. Mrs. Osborne further states that there was upward of 150 bodies buried in this plot of the time of interment ceased here and many years ago. She also says there was another little cemetery just to the north of this one where Rittenhouse crosses 14th Street, and the ground for which was donated by her father, Mr. Bell. This was also for the burying of colored people. Another Brightwood, a lot of cemeteries. Another Brightwood burying ground was in the churchyard of the Emory Methodist Episcopalian Church, ME Church, South. And since this church had its beginning in 1832, it may be presumed that interments began about that time. John Emory, for whom this church was named, was born in Queen Anne County, Maryland in 1789. Of wealthy and influential parents. He was made bishop in 1832, and his body lies buried with that of Bishop Ashbury in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. Even though there's so many little colored cemeteries around and where they move them to, if they move them. A.G. Pierce gave a lot, about half an acre in 1832, which is building the church on the graveyard, and the organizers of the church were blah, 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 Bill, Ray, Lincoln, okay. The first church was a log building, 2 stories high, and the first story of which was conducted what was known as Emory School, and the first free school in this part of the district. I wonder if that's all the way down at the Emory School, all the way down there by I can't think of that. The first free school in this district, in the park, Emory School in the park, in which John Pickett was the teacher for several years. The school was under the direction of the church, the special school trustees being Enos Ray, Osborne. Okay, eventually, additional ground was later obtained by the church for December 17, 1850. A purchase was made from Mr. Pierce, the convenience being made. Okay, and what did they do? The church burying ground behind the log frame church, the exact spot where the original church stood. Then notice Emory Chapel is said to now be occupied by the old Brightwood School on Georgia Avenue and the Church of the Nativity adjoining. It is further recorded that some of the bodies from this graveyard were removed to Rock Creek Cemetery, while others still remain where first interred. For some time past, the writer has tried to trace the course of the old Milk House Ford Road, which was already stated is now labeled Rock Creek Ford Road. Most naturally, it crossed 16th Street at Rock Creek Ford Road and continued westward over the golf course until the road lined with the old trees. What golf course? It encountered, which is a part of the early road. Thence it ran. Oh, geez, I'm gonna start reading this article. Around the clubhouse and continued eastward around the ford a little north of the Mahillian capital. The bridle path on the west of the ford, which can be seen through the woods, is eventually a continuation of the old road. Of course, this is only a surmise and may not be entirely accurate. Unquestionably, the Milkhouse Ford Road was used by J. Hole, an early resident of the site where the club stands. All right. Miss says that she attended the first free white public school at Brightwood, then located on Military Road at that 14th Street, where it's now the colored school, along with the Hall and Chapter School. All right. Let's see. A little of the north of Rock Creek Ford Road on the west side may be seen a narrow roadway through the trees, which was once known as Piling's Lane, since it led to the home of James Piling through the Milkhouse Road, and not far distant and nearer to the creek lived Thomas Tittum on the tract of land in the vicinity nearer to the ford. Okay, we're gonna get back to something else important. I might skip this. I'll put the link to this in there because I didn't want this video. We were way over time in video. I want to read this last article because this story is supposed to be like a part of what was going on in the city. Where you already said they've been changing the roads and all that kind of stuff. The road names, which that's something that happens. But this article is from the Evening Star, March 16th, 1863. The country laundry put in a country laundry put to inconvenience. Yesterday afternoon, the attention of the Sergeant Cronin of the 4th Ward was called to a country wagon laden with bundles of clothing driven up 4th Street by a colored man who was accompanied by a colored woman. Suspicion of larceny on a large scale was raised in the sergeant's mind, and he directed the arrest of the parties, who gave their names as Ann Shaw and George Raymond. Upon interrogating Ann, the sergeant discovered that she was a laundress and lives about 5 miles in the country. So she's on 5th Street. So, which I think is that, which fort? I thought Slocum was over by there. That I thought Fort Slocum was over there, but it doesn't say. But it says okay. Um, Suspicion of larceny. Upon the sergeant determined that she's a laundress and live 5 miles in the country, which the country is, and she comes regularly every week to the city with her wagon, calls at the dwellings of all the families who patronize her, and receives from them the clothing for washing, which accounted for the large load of bundles in the wagon. She named her patrons, and officers were dispatched to inquire concerning her, and the reports were inevitably all right. Of course, the two prisoners were dismissed instantly with the additional testimony of the police in favor of their honesty. So it's just some old people out. They go to the city, pick up laundry, and bring it back to the country and wash it and then bring it back. But because they got all this stuff, these people, military people, think that they done stole something, and so they got to investigate it. And that's just one of the things that happened being a citizen around at the time of the Civil War. So that's that other story. I will put that link in the I didn't mean to run on into that so much. I just thought that it was going to give more information because I didn't actually read all of these newspaper articles. I just kind of like put them all together to kind of create a story. So thank you for watching. See you next time.